the other direction, so I don't get any credit at all. It's good to be with you. I've looked forward to the opportunity to be at Cabot and to get acquainted with you all. I haven't been here before. I've been around Arkansas several times, but not here. And so I'm looking forward to meeting you if I haven't already, and talking and sharing, and already some things in common. And so appreciate all of y'all so much. Look forward to the week that is ahead of us, and just appreciate the elders and their confidence and this time they've made available for all of us. I want to talk to you for a while this morning during Bible class hour about my hero in the Old Testament. And my hero in the Old Testament was a man who doesn't show up very often, but when he does, he makes a difference. And his name was Caleb. Caleb shows up over about a 40-year span of Israelite history, and along with his compatriot Joshua, they took a stand when nobody else would. I think it's one of the greatest stories in the Old Testament. I mean, he was one of those 12 leaders that Moses chose to go on an exploration mission in anticipation of invading the land of Canaan. And out of those 12 leaders, only 2 thought they could take the land. Only 2 thought God was big enough to overcome the giants. And along with Caleb, who was the other one? Joshua. Joshua and Caleb. They tried. They tried to get the people to believe in God, that God could do it. But you know the rest of that story. Because the majority disbelieved, 40 years of walking and 40 years of wandering and 40 years of burying the dead. Somebody asked one time, what did they do for 40 years? They went to funerals every day. That's what they did for 40 years, until they buried an entire generation of unbelievers, and then it was time. For 40 years, Caleb disappears. And in the 14th chapter of Joshua, he shows up again. It's 40 years later. And I want you to read with me in Joshua chapter 14, beginning in verse 6, one of the most powerful speeches in all of Scripture. Joshua 14, beginning in verse 6. It's when Caleb finally, after all of those years, gets his land. Joshua 14:6. Then the sons of Judah drew near to Joshua in Gilgal, and Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite said to him, you know the word which the Lord spoke to Moses the man of God concerning you and me in Kadesh Barnea. I was 40 years old when Moses the servant of the Lord sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought back word to him as it was in my heart. Nevertheless, my brethren who went up with me made the heart of the people melt with fear. But I followed the Lord my God fully. So Moses swore on that day, saying, surely the land on which your foot has trodden will be an inheritance to you and to your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God fully. Now behold, the Lord has let me live just as he spoke these 45 years. From the time that the Lord spoke this word to Moses, when Israel walked in the wilderness, and now, behold, I am 85 years old today. I am still as strong today as I was in the day Moses sent me. As my strength was then, so my strength is now, for war, for going out and for coming in. Now then, give me this hill country, about which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day that Anakim were there, the giants, with great and fortified cities. Perhaps the Lord will be with me, and I will drive them out as the Lord has spoken. So Joshua blessed him and gave Hebron to Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, for an inheritance. Therefore Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, until this day, because he followed the Lord God of Israel fully. You know that phrase occurs 3 times? In verse 14, he followed the Lord of God of Israel fully. In verse 9, he followed the Lord my God fully. And in verse 8, I followed the Lord my God fully. 3 times. The New International Version translates that he followed the Lord wholeheartedly with all of his heart. And when Caleb is giving this speech, he mentions the name of the Lord 10 times. 10 times. God got the glory in Caleb's life and no one else. There's some great lessons just there for you and for me. Here is a man in Caleb who walked in the divine presence. Here is a man who knew God and who built his whole life upon his faith in God. He had a tenacity about him. He had a toughness about him, a passion. He had an enormous faith, and none of it was accident, because Caleb lived his whole life, I call it at soul level, in connection with God, in relationship with God. That was Caleb. And Caleb-type people are rare. We live in what has been called the aging of America. There's a lot of people in their 70s and 80s and 90s and beyond. So in our time, older age is not uncommon at all. What is uncommon, however, are the people who don't just grow older, but who grow better and who grow wiser because they walk with God. And that was Caleb. Here was a man who had very strong convictions, and he lived by those convictions. Here was a man who accepted the challenge of faith, and he was undeterred, whether he was in his 40s or whether he was in his 80s. Here was a man who epitomized faith from his younger years to his older years. You remember when you were a kid, people would ask you, what do you want to be when you grow up? Remember that? I want to tell you what I want to be when I grow up. Like 85? I want to be like Caleb. This man is nothing short of inspiring. Caleb. Now, I say that because I don't want to be like some older people. Sometimes I see some older people drifting back into self-centeredness, almost a certain childishness where they think the world kind of starts revolving around them. I don't want to be that way. I don't want to be an older person I see sometimes who get very impatient with young people, always negative to any new ideas. I don't want to be like some older people I see sometimes who get a little irritable and crusty and sometimes mean, complaining, criticizing. Nothing is ever right. I don't want to be that way, because Caleb wasn't that way. He's 85 years old, and his life is nothing short of faith-inspiring. Here was a man who transcended the age gap, who bridged the generation gap. I don't care if he was 85 years old. This is the kind of man I would follow. This is the kind of man I'd want to spend a day with. This is the kind of man who would motivate me to live a better life, higher life, more noble life, more faithful life. That's Caleb. And he's not the only one. Scripture is filled with examples of people who, in the last years of their lives, were some of the best years of their lives. Enoch, it says, walked with God until, as somebody said, he walked far enough. God said, hey, it's closer to my house than yours. Come on home with me, you know. Abraham, it says Abraham died a ripe old age, an old man satisfied with life. I love that. Moses was 120 and died on the mountain, remember? And Joshua was Caleb's peer. And in very similar fashion, he had the same kind of faith Caleb did. So I sat down one day and I took my legal pad and I just started writing down qualities that I admire in older people. And I thought of 10. I came up with 10 qualities I admire in older people, and I call them Caleb qualities. 10 Caleb qualities. So somebody asked if I use PowerPoint. No, I tell you what I do. I give you assignments. I make you write instead of me write. So I'm going to give you 10 things, 10 Caleb qualities. So in any lesson I do, you can write stuff down. All right? So that kind of saves you from coming up to me in the foyer afterwards and saying, now what was point number 7? You know? And we're not going to be here all day. These are kind of bullet type points, okay? So write this down. Number 1, Caleb. The Caleb man will be a man or woman of gratitude. When I think about qualities in older people I admire, that's one of the first things that comes into my mind, and that is an attitude of gratitude. I say that because sometimes gratitude takes a licking in the aging process. Rather than being grateful for what we have, rather than being gracious for what we have, some older people adopt an attitude of, entitlement. We can become demanding. We can forget to show appreciation. The very kind words like thank you suddenly are no longer a part of our vocabulary. I want to be an older person whose conversation and communication is marked with appreciation for what God allows me to have. Remember Luke 17, Jesus heals 10 people. Remember that? He heals 10 people, and out of the 10, only one bothered to come back and say thank you. But that's culture, whether it was in the first century or in the 21st century. We forget sometimes to be thankful. And that's what ingratitude is all about. From the immature toddler who demands that his or her parents just constantly wait on him, to the teenager who thinks the world revolves around him or her, all the way to the older person who forgets to be thankful and grateful and gracious. Ingratitude has always been a problem. But when I think about older people I look up to and older people I respect, I noticed every one of them is marked by an attitude of gratitude. They never stop saying thank you to God for what they have, for their health and for their opportunities and for the blessings they enjoy. They never stop saying thank you to their mate for years of love and companionship and care. They never stop saying thank you to their friends for the encouragement they receive. They never stop saying thank you to young people, the younger generation, who they see trying hard. And they want to do everything they can to encourage these younger ones. So I guess the question to ask all of us is this: when somebody does something for you, what's your response? Do you have an attitude of entitlement? Or do you have an attitude of appreciation? 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 18 says, in everything give thanks. And that's true, folks, at any age. There's no age limitation to that. So the Caleb man is a man or woman of gratitude. Secondly, The Caleb man is interested in the world of the younger generation. The Caleb man is interested in the world of the younger generation. Now, those who are younger need to understand that the aging process is not all that easy to endure. And sometimes there's a natural tendency for older people to drift into jealousy, to minimize the accomplishments of young people, and to constantly compare and tell stories that always start with, well, back in the day. You know that's Bible. That's in the Bible. Hold your finger here. Ezra 3, 11 and 12. Ezra chapter 3 and verse 11 and 12. They're building the new temple. The temple of Solomon is no more. It's been destroyed. This is post-captivity. So they're rebuilding the temple. And in Ezra 3 and verse 11 and 12, it talks about the response of the people in the building of this temple. It says, they sang, praising and giving thanks to the Lord, saying, for He is good, for His loving kindness is upon Israel forever. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. So they're building the new temple, and everybody's excited about that. But verse 12. Many of the priests and Levites and heads of fathers' households, the old men who had seen the first temple, wept with a loud voice when the foundation of this house was laid before their eyes. Why? Because it wasn't as big. It wasn't as beautiful. It wasn't anything in their eyes compared to the old Solomonic temple. And all the young people are excited, and all the young people are rejoicing, and they're singing, and they're praising, and they're giving thanks. And the old men are sitting around going, you ought to have seen the temple back in my day. And Haggai, the little prophet Haggai, minor prophet, in chapter 2 and verse 3, who's contemporary to Ezra, Haggai says to the older people, you're discouraging the young people when you do that. You're discouraging them. And in fact, Haggai chastised them for that. And sometimes if we're not careful, by constantly comparing, we can do that too. Now, that said, there's a lot of neat stuff back in the day. I think the most ideal time in American history is post-World War II, the 1950s and early 60s. And some of you can remember a time when you never had to lock a door. Anybody remember that? You never had to lock anything because nobody's going to steal anything. You never locked a door. Life was really simple back then. I remember as a little boy, after Sunday school, we called it Sunday school back then. I remember after Sunday school, all the men would disappear. And they'd go all out on the porch or out back, and you know what they were doing? Go ahead and say it. What were they doing? Smoking. They were smoking. Nobody thought a thing about it back then. Nobody knew that much about it back then. It's just what people did, and it's like we were in a time warp of just being naive, but we didn't care. You know, that was the 50s and early 60s. That was that kind of time. It was a very happy, idyllic time. Kids today come home from school and say, "What'd you do today?" "Oh, we had a fire drill." Big deal. In my day, back in the day, we didn't have fire drills. We had atomic bomb drills. Anybody remember those? Do you understand why the Russians never attacked America? It's because they knew that every future American leader was protected, because you would get under that wooden desk in elementary school and cover your head, and so they knew it was senseless to attack America because every future leader was protected by that wooden desk. That's why I say it was a very naive time. But we didn't care. I've got a friend in North Carolina who has a 57 Chevy. It's a gorgeous car. He's won Charlotte a couple of times. And last time I was over there, he said, let's run up to Mount Airy, spend the day where Andy Griffith was from and all that kind of deal. So it was a great place to take the car. So we drove up there. And we're driving along, and just an odd feeling to be in a vehicle with no seatbelts. No seatbelts. It also didn't have any air conditioning or power steering. Well, it did have air conditioning. It was called 360 air. Anybody know what that was? What's 360 air? Roll the windows down, and you got all the air you want. Now, it's hot as it can be, but you got air. Back in the day. There's a lot of good stuff back in the day. But I'll tell you, there's a lot of good stuff today. We don't live in a bad time as far as convenience goes. Air conditioning's pretty nice. I'm all for indoor plumbing. And communications these days. I used to watch the Jetsons on Saturday mornings sometimes, and I thought, all this futuristic stuff. And yet it's like we live in the Jetsons age. The communication, I can FaceTime somebody on the other side of the world and sit there and communicate in that way. Who would have ever thought that a few years ago? The point is, the Caleb man doesn't resent whatever time he lives in. He doesn't resent it. The Caleb man doesn't feel threatened when the baton of leadership, for example, is passed to the next generation. In fact, the Caleb man helps to prepare the next generation. The Caleb man does everything he can to encourage the next generation so he can make the next generation successful. Those of you who are older, is your goal every time you walk in here to try and encourage somebody? I hope so. I hope so. Because when you come to encourage someone else, guess what happens? They encourage you. You know, there's some Wednesday nights in the winter. I'll be painfully truthful. There's some Wednesday nights in the winter when I just as soon crank my lazy boy into third gear, turn up the fireplace, and just sit there. Because it's drizzly outside, it's 35 degrees, it's dark, and been dark since 5 o'clock. And but I get up and I go to Bible study. And it's an odd thing, I have never left Bible study on a Wednesday night, even in the winter, that I wasn't glad I went, because somebody there needed my encouragement. It never fails, and it never fails that somebody there encouraged me. That's how that works. So you can be the kind of person we're talking about. The Caleb man, the Caleb woman. Number 3, the Caleb man keeps his mind focused and sharp. The Caleb man keeps his mind focused and sharp. I notice a similarity in older people I admire. They all know what's going on today. They read, they think broadly. They're not afraid of new ideas. They're not afraid of new challenges. Caleb was 85 years old, and he was willing to take on the new challenge of the hill country. One of the ways we can avoid this negative, detrimental, faith-killing kind of thinking is to keep our mind sharp, to keep our mind active. My grandmother was born in 1906, and she lived to see the 21st century. And when she was Caleb's age and older, every Sunday night she'd have all the young people to her house for pizza. The kids would bring the pizza, she would supply the house, and the kids would they loved on her, and all of them called her Nana too, and so they all came over there and hung out every Sunday night. And she loved it. I asked her one time, I said, Nana, why don't you hang around people your age? She said, son, people my age are in the cemetery. And she said, some of them who aren't ought to be. She's kind of crusty, you know. But I think she had a point. The Caleb man keeps his mind sharp and focused. The Caleb man thinks big. Some people get it because they see the bigger picture. They don't look at life from the small view, they look at life from the large view. And years of experience and years of walking with God have taught them that you don't have to panic when sudden events grab the headlines and are on the news 24/7, and everybody else is running around in Chicken Little mode. Older people just kind of take it in stride and say, God's on the throne. God's on the throne. Because they understand Romans 8 and verse 28, God causes all things to work together for good to those who love Him and to those who are called. Or Psalm 55 and verse 22, cast your burdens on the Lord. He'll take care of you. See, that was Caleb. But that was Caleb when he was 40. But it's also Caleb when he was in his 80s. Now, some people think old age and wisdom go together, that they're just synonymous. No. In the 32nd chapter of Job, Job 32 and verse 9, he says that's not true. In Job 32 and verse 9, he says, the abundant in years, so here's somebody who's lived a long life, the abundant in years may not be wise, nor may elders understand justice. What he's saying is the wisest aren't always the oldest. The wisest are those who live and inhale the breath of the Almighty, who haven't just grown older in years, but they've grown wiser because they've walked with God. That's Caleb and Joshua and Joseph and so many others we could name. They think big because they have a big God. Number 5, the Caleb man doesn't quit. The Caleb man never quits. Hey, Caleb, we're getting ready to invade Canaan. And Caleb says, you guys know how old I am. You know, you younger guys go on ahead. I think I'm going to run down here to Cracker Barrel and sit on the front porch in one of those rocking chairs. That's not what he said. He was ready to go. Now, an interesting thing happens as you age. You have to slow down. Your body kind of sends you messages that say, slow down. Sometimes you have to walk away from a full-time job, or they may retire you. I don't know. But you can't retire from life. Every one of us are on a life mission as long as God lets us live. And that mission is to glorify Him in everything we do. 1 Corinthians 10:31, whether you eat, drink, whatever you do, that's everything. Do all to the glory of God. There's no time limit on that. There's no age limit on that. You don't retire from your service to God. As long as you're breathing, as long as you're taking up space on God's planet, apparently He wants you here. Apparently He has a reason for leaving you here. When He changes His mind, He'll let you know. But until then, stay engaged. Stay busy. Because age happens and I can't do some things doesn't mean I can't do anything. Caleb was 85 years old. And he said, give me the hill country. Give me the hill country. Number 6, the Caleb man gives back more than he takes. This Caleb personality will give back more than he takes. In Mark chapter 12, Jesus watched people putting into the treasury. Remember that scene? And there was a widow there who put in just measly. And the disciples didn't notice her, didn't pay her any attention. If you and I had been there, we probably wouldn't either. But Jesus noticed her because Jesus could read her heart and knew what she had just done. She was a giver. I don't know who wrote this. Some people are stagnant ponds that accumulate simply for self-gratification. Other people are rivers through whom blessings flow. This woman in Mark chapter 12 was a river. She understood that the freshness is in the flow. She couldn't give much, but you know, Jesus didn't care about the amount anyway. What she could, she gave. And that reminds me that selfish or selfless older people, like her in Mark chapter 12, selfless older people are an invaluable resource in a local church. And maybe we've had to retire from full-time job, and maybe we don't have the income production we used to have, but I tell you, as the income production goes down, the value production can go up. And so my question this morning is to the older people, are you adding value to this church? What kind of value production are you adding to this church? The Caleb man gives back more than he takes. Number 7, the Caleb man is compassionate. He's compassionate. I read an interview the other day, kind of a survey, and they were asking the question of who has impacted your life the most? And one of the leading answers was my grandfather, my grandmother. And that may not be the case for everyone, but it's the case for many of us. Sometimes moms and dads get really busy and preoccupied, and grandparents have a tremendous role to play. And grandparents come along with compassion and kindness and time and patience. And grandparents have a way of teaching us things about life that we need to hear. And those are the kind of people that as you grow older, you never forget. You know, I studied Jesus in Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, and if he's noted for anything, Jesus was noted for his compassion for people. Wherever they were, he met them where they were, and he gave them compassion. And there's no time limit on compassion, none. That's the Caleb man. Number 8, the Caleb man loves his wife passionately. I don't think anything is as touching as when you see older people in the sunset of life still very much in love. Married 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, beyond. They're still affectionate with one another. They're still caring for one another. They're still mindful of the little things that make the big difference. I read this the other day. Let me share this with you, a couple paragraphs. It was about a young lady who's interviewing her grandfather. And she asked him this question. She says, Grandpa, she says, do you and Grandma ever have conflicts after 60 years of marriage? He laughed. Of course we do. Why, just this morning, E, that's what he called his wife. He just called her by the letter E. E was driving the car. And she didn't make a full stop at the stop sign. So I said to her, E, later on tonight when there's a better time, I've got a thought I want to share with you. He went on to explain, you see, I learned a long time ago that she is very sensitive about criticism because she had a father who could be mean, and he often badly hurt her feelings when she was only a child. So I'm careful not to say things that will remind her of those moments. And the best thing to do is wait until she can handle my criticism. His granddaughter said, are you telling me that there are sensitivities that can be hurt, that can hurt and go back 80 years? Absolutely, he said. Some of these things you never forget. And if you're going to love each other in your old age, they can't be overlooked. You have to be just as careful not to hurt each other in your old age as you were in your youth. So he says, here's what I'm going to do. Tonight, after we've had a good meal, and we're sitting on the porch, watching the sun go down, and we're very happy with each other, I'll say, E, I love you very much. But this morning when we were driving, you blew it. I love that. Pick your moments, I guess, you know. The Caleb man loves his wife passionately. Number 9, the Caleb man knows God personally. I was at a meeting in Alabama, and this older man led the closing prayer. I think he was 100. And a younger man was standing next to me, and when the prayer was over, he leaned over and he said, "You know, when I listen to him pray, it's like he knows God personally." And I thought, well, there's a reason for that, because he knows God personally. The Caleb man knows God personally. In the 2nd chapter of Luke, when God got ready to introduce his son to the world, do you know he used an older man, an older woman to do that? The Bible doesn't say how old Simeon was, but the Bible does say how old Anna was. Anna was 84 years old. I assume Simeon was a similar age. So out of all of the people God could have used, he picked an older man and an older woman. Why? Because sometimes it takes older people to see what the rest of us are too busy to notice. The Caleb man knows God personally. And number 10, the Caleb man isn't afraid to die. There in Luke chapter 2, read with me in Luke 2, beginning in verse 27. Well, really, back in verse 25, there was a man in Jerusalem, his name was Simeon. We just mentioned him. It had been revealed to him, verse 26, by the Holy Spirit that he would not see death before he had seen the Christ. And he came in the Spirit into the temple. And when the parents brought in the child Jesus to carry out the custom of the law, that he, Simeon, the old man, Simeon, took him into his arms and blessed God and said, "Now, Lord, you are releasing your bondservant to depart in peace according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the presence of all of the people, a light of revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel." Here's this old man Simeon, and he's holding this baby. And he says, now I'm ready to go. Now, Lord, you can take me home, because I have seen with my eyes your salvation. Ecclesiastes 11 and verse 8 says, "Even if a man should live many years, let him rejoice in them all." All, to the very end. You think we could learn something for Caleb-type people? I think we better. I think all of us better. You know, there's so many questions I can't answer about Caleb. How tall was Caleb? I don't know. Did Caleb have a sense of humor? I don't know. Was Caleb good working with his hands and building things? I don't know. Was Caleb athletic? Maybe musically inclined? I don't know. Don't know any of that. I know this: he served God with his whole heart. And when he was 85 years old, he was still alert, he was still filled with faith and vision, and he was ready to tackle a new challenge. There's a lot I don't know about him, but I know this: when I grow up, I want to be just like him. I was coming across Louisiana, southern Louisiana, on Interstate 10, coming out of Texas, and I stopped. It was the middle of the afternoon. I stopped in Lafayette, Louisiana, at a Chick-fil-A. It was about 2, 3 in the afternoon, and I was kind of getting sleepy, and I needed a little pick-me-up. So I stopped at this Chick-fil-A to get a cup of coffee. And I walked in the middle of the afternoon to get a cup of coffee, and the young man behind the counter waited on me. He got my coffee, and he handed it to me, and I pulled out some money. He leaned over like he didn't want anybody else to hear. He leaned over and he said, "I don't charge for older people coffee." Well, I'm not sure Chick-fil-A would have been happy with that comment, not because he didn't charge, but I think probably he should have said senior coffee. But I loved it. I don't charge for older people coffee. So there are perks. There are perks to getting older. All right, thank you all very much. It's 9:43 and 38 seconds, so I quit early. You're on your own.